All right, so it's 2 minutes after 12. We've got a pretty good group of people already here. When the Ostroms were here, we had a hard and fast rule. We start on time, we end on time. And the consequence of that was everybody showed up on time. Now we sort of wait for people, and so people feel free to come later. But anyway, so I'm really privileged to introduce my friend Hanna Schreiber from the University of Warsaw. She's one of the, I would say, world's leading experts on cultural heritage, especially treated as a commons. She's been working in this area for a long time. She's been part of UNESCO meetings. She studies UNESCO meetings. Her work is endlessly fascinating, and I having read the paper, I know the same is true of what she's going to present to us today. She visited the workshop for the first time a year ago, and she's already back for more. Congratulations to us on doing a good job of making her feel wanted. And so without any further ado, Hanna.
Thank you so much for this amazingly kind introduction. But I would say that the whole honor privilege is on my side, and I'm especially thankful for your mentorship here. And I also for all the wonderful feedback I have received even before this presentation today from you, from Michael McGuinness, and from Scott, who is probably online or in New York today, but they were very influential to the version I'm presenting today. I would also like to acknowledge the equal intellectual contribution to my presentation today of my co-author, Bartosz Pieliński. Bartosz is professor at the University of Warsaw. He's sociologist, political scientist, public policy expert, and he was the one who exposed me to Ostrom ideas. And it's thanks to him I'm actually doing what I'm doing. He was also co-founder of the Institutional Grammar Research Initiative. I would also like to say that if not here, then nowhere we can get some wonderful, friendly, critical feedback. And that is why we have allowed ourselves to prepare some pieces of paper that I would very much encourage you to take. One piece of paper is our kind request for your written feedback. Sometimes things get lost when in the discussion, and I believe that this is the best community to receive this feedback. So please feel free to write whatever you wish, though there are obviously some ideas of how to organize your feedback in this paper. And there is a human-friendly version of the diagram that you could see in the paper in a miniature. So as also, don't freak out about this diagram right now. I'll try to make it more easy later on. So the general plan of our presentation is today is to make a short introduction about the history of lists, registers, inventories, catalogs, archives. It's almost impossible to make it short, but I'll try, please bear with me. Then I will reflect a little bit on what lists are and what they do to us. And at the end, we will try to fight with the institutional analysis and development framework application to heritage lists. Let me start with the citation from Umberto Eco, very famous Italian philosopher, semiotician, great writer and historian, who was reflecting very much about the cultural phenomenon of lists. Lists are, we can say that there are diverse modes of keeping information and organizing human knowledge about the universe. Those modes may take diverse forms: lists, registers, repositories, inventories, catalogs, and they have been accompanying humans since ancient time. We look here not into practical lists like to-do lists, groceries lists, or in this case, Don Giovanni woman list, but into the socially meaningful and arranged lists as cultural universals appearing everywhere, from astronomic compendia in Mesopotamia to the World Heritage List that encompass today 1,157 sites. Despite being separated in time and space, they all share the same aim with which they were created. That is, to select particular objects, items, artifacts, but also ideas above others, and organize these parts into a new collective whole with sometimes very powerful signifying capacity. One of the most well-known collecting endeavors concerns people, animals, and species that shall be saved and is presented in the Bible. Noah is presented there as the first collector who saves them by collecting them on the ark from the flood. By doing so, he preserves them and gives them new life and the possibility to extend their lives through the lives of new generations that will appear thanks to them. As some researchers argue, the collection is the only bastion against the passage of time, and Noah probably the only one among all the collectors in the history who managed to create a complete collection. At least that's what the Bible says. But nothing is known if Noah collected them according to any written list. We know that no one was so successful in managing its large collection or a large amount of information without the lists. In the Roman Empire, Pliny the Elder, in his 37 volumes of natural history, expand this attempt by collecting all available information about the Roman Empire in the form of lists. His lists express an ideal of total knowledge and total order that is both scholarly and imperial in intent. His attempt was so influential that it served as a prototype for encyclopedic lists until the 16th century. In the second half of the 16th century, rulers, poets, writers, popes, merchants, royal officials were seized by the fashion or even what is called in the literature madness of collecting. Although European courts and religious institutions were accumulating treasures and wonders from the world much earlier, they became a product of the intellectual and economic upheaval of the Renaissance period. Cabinets of curiosities have become so numerous, and in the sources from the era, the figures speak about hundreds and thousands, that it is impossible to ignore their importance as social and cultural phenomenon. Through repositories, catalogs, and inventories, the overwhelming macrocosm becomes domesticated and miniaturized to become closer to a human being. And thanks to lists, it also becomes organized. In 2012, the London Archaeological Archive and Research Centre was named by the Guinness World Records as the world's largest archaeological archive. They store 5 million artifacts and records of nearly 8,500 London excavations on 10 kilometers of shelving and 120,000 brown boxes that you can see here. These numbers are overwhelming, but because of the organized structure of those collections, we can navigate through them quite usually successfully. Decisions, however, on how to organize these resources are always combined with the creation of relevant categories and the selection of what should finally appear in the collection. They are never neutral. The idea of registering, inventorying, and listing doesn't have to be related to any tangible objects. The list of 10 commandments is one of many examples of lists that create and shape our knowledge and understanding how the world should function. Our collective intentionality can also give us many more examples, such as list of 100 most important ideas that change the world history, infinite number of golden rules for good housewives, or 10 rules of gym etiquette. And this drives us to the double character of lists that is present in the Governing the Commons. Governing the Commons are famous for delivering to us, again, in the form of a list, 8 design principles that are obviously abstract rules. At the same time, we find in this book plenty examples of described natural commons that are able to function thanks to the enforcement of the concept of the list related directly to tangible objects, such as in the case cited here of the fisheries in Alanya in Turkey. The Alanya fishermen joined together to create a simple but very clever system of sharing. They created lists of those who were allowed to fish the area, the named locations where they could fish, and the type of equipment allowed. Each September, the eligible fishermen drew lots. The lot drawn determined at which named location they would start the fishing season. And this listing system gave everyone a fair chance at each named location, and at the end ensured clarity, fairness, and the continued viability of our fisheries. Governing the commons was also for us a starting point to understand how much LIN's research is connected to heritage lists. A good example for that is the irrigation system in Valencia and Murcia in Spain, the one she analyzed in the Governing the Commons. This system was inscribed into the UNESCO Intangible Heritage List in 2009, and 10 years later into the Food and Agriculture Organization Heritage List. That's a very interesting new list, and the concept of globally important agricultural heritage systems is defined as listing living, evolving system of human communities in an intricate relationship with their territory, culture, or agricultural landscape, or biophysical and wider social environment. Even a brief analysis of both those lists shows that they contain multiple examples of commons, even if some of them were not recognized as specifically heritage commons or cultural commons by Ostrom or Ostrom scholars, such as in the case of the irrigation system in Spain. She never used the term heritage. However, this happens so, and this closeness exists because heritage involves the intergenerational transfer of information, knowledge, practical skills, and attitudes to a shared resources, recognized by communities and groups as constituting their identity. In practice, the most successful commons in terms of their sustainable governance that Ostrom studied were examples of long-term cooperation based on established rules by diverse cultural groups and communities. And the driving idea of both heritage lists, the UNESCO one and the Food and Agricultural Organization one, evoke great similarity to Ostrom concepts and approaches. So let me now reflect a little bit on the main attributes of heritage lists, the one I mentioned to you before. What lists actually are? We consider them as intersubjective indication of what an international community considered as embodying the idea of the heritage of humanity. The systems for protecting heritage were created with this idea to protect heritage that is much more important which importance crosses its meaning only for local or national community. It's important for the world and for the humanity as such. They are also sources of knowledge about what heritage of humanity really is, but also shared resources in their own right, because they are perceived by this community as valuable and in need of protection from the loss of their inherent value, that is credibility. No one will care about UNESCO Heritage List if they will not be considered credible. They are also end products of decisions made by actually a range of stakeholders. Despite the decisions on what to inscribe or not happen at the international level, the decisions on what to nominate to this international level always take place on national and local levels. What lists do? We usually call with my co-author, we use the abbreviation 3S because they select, they safeguard, and they share, but there's more than these 3 S's here. Obviously, they select important objects and practices as representing heritage of humanity, but they also, by monitoring after the inscription and sanctioning if there is any deterioration of the state of a site or practice, they safeguard this cultural heritage. They also share important information and knowledge about most important and valued heritage elements. They produce new meanings for the inscribed elements, because after the inscription, they are no longer only local heritage or national heritage things. They belong to humanity, and humanity looks at them. But they also change in time as our interpretation of what should constitute heritage of humanity changes. This is a friendly version of our diagram showing how we interpret the 3 levels that you can find on the diagram. So we start from the constitutional level, which is actually a moment when the whole regime was established, the moment when the decisions were signed, and when the convention, 1972 World Heritage Convention and 2003 Intangible Heritage Convention were taken. And after the regime is established, we are no longer able to influence the legal document that is produced in the form of an international treaty. But what we do, we year by year need to discuss and to reinterpret what heritage of humanity really is by taking decisions on what to inscribe to World Heritage Lists or to intangible cultural heritage lists. And this is the collective choice, or better to say policy level, where the credibility dilemma is embedded. How to protect the credibility of the convention, of the list, of all organs involved in this very, I would say, intense decision-taking time. I'm following this since 15 years. It's very, very intense time. And at the end, we also look into the very operational level. So the level which is mostly connected to what happens on the ground. And you can obviously hear the Liberty Island with the Liberty statue that is also inscribed into the World Heritage List. And this is less friendly version of this, so that you can find in these papers. This figure shows 3 levels of action arenas presented in a simplified, obviously, version of AID and applied to the three levels. The action area on the constitutional level is presented in this left top part of the figure. The idea of heritage of humanity and how to protect it is being translated into an international legal document and produces actually 2 particular outcomes, which are UNESCO conventions. And under the auspices of UNESCO, community of states and agreements are reached, and that created also UNESCO list. UNESCO list functions on the basis of legal documents. They doesn't function as programs. They are legally rooted elements. The collective choice arena in the middle of the figure is where decisions are made regarding the content of the list and about how the convention functions in practice. That translates into also production of a much larger, longer and more complex documents accompanying international treaty, which are called operational directives or operational guidelines. And on the level of these accompanying documents, the whole quarrels take place, and the decision on the evaluation criteria, decision on what we want to see on the list or not. And then this is this operational level. At the bottom of the diagram represents the action arena responsible for the everyday governance of list element. It is important to understand that each list element is related to the 2 flow of ideas, one related to a local, regional, or national culture, and the second one directly related to heritage of humanity. The same goes for rules governing the site or the practice. Arenas are not only linked in the top-down direction, but also in the bottom-up, and the flow of ideas is rather circular, not linear. The second bottom-up link is the link between the evaluation criteria. So I would like to discuss a little bit the credibility dilemma that we find as particularly interesting when it comes to the governing of the heritage list. We have analyzed, and you could see in the latest version of the paper some excerpts of the analysis of summary records of the committee meetings taking decisions on inscriptions, how delegates and how international community interprets in practice what credibility means for them. And actually, it is quite interesting to observe that they use 2 terms describing credibility. Either we see in summary records credibility itself, but we may also see a different terminology, which is the spirit of the convention. And the credibility appears to be interpreted as something inherent for the whole system. Delegates speak about the credibility of the lists if they fear that a nomination doesn't meet the criteria of really well-prepared nomination, or they fear and they see that, for example, the cultural element inscribed contains racist, anti-Semitic, or Islamophobic elements. And this happened. So, and then we face the delisting to keep the credibility of the list. And this happened already several times. So credibility is also about the organs taking decisions. Delegates tend to say to themselves, if we want to keep this organ credible, our decision cannot go in this direction. So there is not, I would say, there is an intuitive understanding of what credibility is, but it permeates all UNESCO meetings. So actually at the operational level, credibility dilemma, keeping the list valuable, recognized by everyone as valuable, is one of the elements. It may also turn into the situation that credibility will be used as a term explaining why we will accept a nomination, despite it is a very badly prepared nomination, not meeting the criteria. But we will use the term credibility to say, we want this nomination to be inscribed, despite the country didn't prepare it properly, because it is the underdeveloped country, or it is a heritage element representing small islands, yes? And they are facing so many difficulties. Or maybe because this nomination comes from a country that is right now struggling with an internal conflict or flood. So we will use credibility not only as a very technical criterion, but also to feel this term with different meanings that opens us up to the reality that we are facing at hand. So we will, summarizing this issue, we will say that the heritage of humanity regimes cease to exist when lists become irrelevant for international, national, and local actors. And their relevancy is ensured as long as they are credible. However, the credibility has to be secured by all actors at all three levels. It must be credible for national authorities and local community dealing with the site or a practice. But what we see as most visible dilemma, it is happening on the operational level. Yes, so despite having this meeting all levels, we observe that this actual discussion and implementation into the decisions taken of what credibility really means happens at their operational level. So credibility dilemma associated with heritage lists that we also were discussing in our previous paper about inclusion and exclusion tension is about how to keep the value of the list by inscribing high quality heritage elements, but at the same time include in the list as many heritage elements from our country as possible, because it's our prestige, it's boosting our soft power. That is why we have over 1,000 inscriptions to World Heritage List. And we don't see the end of this list. Maybe in our lifetime, we will achieve several thousands, and without the list, we will not be able to memorize them, obviously. But the same goes with intangible heritage list, and the food and agriculture heritage system is also expanding year by year. So this is all what we have prepared for you. Thank you for your attention. Please feel free to react with any possible critical remarks. Fill maybe the forms also for us, and I'm happy to accept any questions you may have. Can we also turn maybe to our online speakers? I think Bartosz shall be here, so he can also see us and we can see him.
And then get it switched.
Okay, thank you.
I'm happy to keep a queue.
Joins you.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, Diego.
Well, first of all, congratulations. I've been reading many of your work, and it's really amazing because we're talking about culture. It's really, really important for us. I have different questions and and things that I want to clarify with you. Obviously, when we are talking about culture, we are talking about potential, really potential conflicts, because we are talking about power, we are talking all of that's true. One of the things that I haven't seen in this paper, I'm not sure if you have others, it's around who is in those committees and who appoints them, how they are selected. That's one of the questions. The other is around, you say that one of the elements they avoid to select things that would do racist and all of that. In your experience, how they handle, for instance, churches, because churches in many ways, for some people, can be considered racist against indigenous people, for instance, how they manage these kind of social dilemmas in which, at the end, which is true, right? And there is something that struck me at the beginning, because this is the first word that you have in your paper, that is this relation around list make culture, or the culture makes the list. You put it like the first one. Not sure if it's the opposite, or I understand the fact that when the list is created, that creates a different sense of what should be culture. But we are talking about social dilemmas, as you say, people select something that creates the thing like how we select that.
Thank you so much. I have noted your question. Shall I we take more, or I shall reply immediately? Okay, so when it comes to appointment of these committees and these bodies, this is international legal system. So we have a system of sovereign states. So there is the rule is that each state is equally important. So Barbados or Poland is equally important as the United States of America. It's, you know, abstract rule, but this helps us to also turn into the geographical representation idea, which is very much important for the whole United Nations system. So both in all intergovernmental committees that are being selected are selected to represent all geographical regions. There are 6 geographical regions, and they have their own electoral groups. And within these groups, countries meet and decide, well, we will nominate this time Brazil to represent Latin American region, and maybe Argentina too, because you were not here for, you know, last 5 years, so we want now to. So it's a matter of regional negotiations, which country will represent the whole region in the international system. And then you have so you have 24, for example, states parties representing the whole world, but none of the regions is not represented. It's a rule that it must be represented. The other way that I haven't been talking to, the other problem that I haven't been talking here, but this geographical representation does not translate into the geographical balance of the list itself. The World Heritage List actually has more than 50% of inscriptions of European descent. Because when we are speaking about, for example, missionary churches in Latin America, they are inscribed as from Brazil, yes, for example, but they obviously have European decency here, yes. So that's a huge problem, and countries are addressing this issue. That's why they are more prone to accept less well-prepared nominations from other regions to address this problem of geographical imbalance. When it comes to racist things, this is, I would say that we are observing a great turn in this system. Let me give you one example, very recent one, from the Intergovernmental Committee meeting in Morocco that happened in December last year, so 22, like several months ago. I was witnessing this discussion that was on the delisting of the so-called Dukas dat. I'm describing this in a paper a little bit in a nutshell. So it's an element that of the process of a procession that happens in one of the small medieval cities in Belgium that contains a figure of the savage. It's Le Sauvage. And it's always a white person that is painted black, in chains, and with a ring and nose. And it's used, you know, Belgian Congo history is one of the worst genocides that happened, colonial genocide. And people come to see this person in this procession. They take their kids and ask this person, you know, to frighten their kids because it's element of their tradition. And it has been on this list for years and nobody was really like taking care. Nobody was really aware what's happening. But with the moment we discovered what is really the practice happening in this huge procession, it was no way it will be still on the list as representing heritage of humanity. And I would say that I'm feeling that this year, because the meeting this year will happen in Botswana, in Kasane, we will observe a great review of the list, because there are plenty of cultural traditions that are based on racist elements. They are based on, for example, infringement of animal rights. And we are changing our sensitivity towards it, yes? 30 years ago, who would care about whether we have any vegetarians in the group? Now it's normal that you can ask, yes, to have a vegetarian diet or vegan diet. And this last question was about the selection. Yes, but I noted very.
The last one was around the first quote that you used.
Is the list a product of culture or culture a product of a list? I would say it's like chicken and egg issue, yes? Well, obviously, the idea here and the idea that is coming from the research done in the museology and archive studies field, they are huge research fields, is that and the selection process is based on some cultural assumptions, yes? And at the same time, but this doesn't come from nowhere, yes? And at the same time, if we enforce this selective criteria, they enforce back our way of thinking about the world, yes? We can omit or not see that there is an important category that should be there, and we will forget that these things really exist. So that will be my answer.
Okay, we have 4 names on the list. Mike is next.
Hannah, thanks for the presentation. I can't talk to you while you're here. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the broader context of the politics within which this listing process occurs. You've been there, you've sort of seen it. And I'm particularly interested in the groups who are very skeptical of this whole process. And because, you know, UNESCO has a wide ambit sort of stuff they can cover, and you're focusing on the human rights part, which is a broad, so there's lots of different sort of emphasis within human rights. And I'm wondering, for example, how people who are activist groups who are primarily interested in indigenous groups, react to this, because you said there's a strong bias towards Europeans and it all goes through state processes. Not all the states are all that supportive of encouraging more appreciation of the indigenous culture. So is that a direction? I mean, you've talked about racism as what, but is that another sort of direction for opposition or skepticism towards this whole process?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That's a wonderful question, actually, because this is exactly what we observe in the system. So the system is changing, and the credibility also is about giving voice to those who were excluded from the system. This is a very fascinating process that I observed, because I also, after representing for some years my national delegation, I turned into the NGO sector, and I'm representing right now an NGO, and I'm observing how NGO sector is gaining a voice in the system, how they are, you know, trying to push the doors, you know, to enter to the room and say, well, we have some other idea for you to discuss. So definitely, I would say that we see 2 turns. One turn in the system is to embrace non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, local communities more. This is a huge and dramatic change for the system that was designed solely for states. And that's not easy, but this is happening and we observe it. And they use the idea that we can't, and this is also so visible, I think, in this Ostrom legacy, yes, and in these works that were radical in saying that we need actually these voices of communities to be heard. When it comes to indigenous groups, it went even more into institutional forms. For example, for World Heritage Arena, a huge scandal was related to some national parks that were inscribed as natural heritage. That after the inscriptions to UNESCO Heritage List, we're removing indigenous populations from the park in order, to make tourists happy seeing only animals, without these crazy people. And, if the people will wear traditional clothes, that would be fine, but these people have mobile phones. This is not what we accept. This is not the exoticism we want to see. So this discussion already happened, and in 2007, well, very recently, but it happened, in 2017, it led to the establishment of the World Indigenous Peoples Forum for World Heritage Sites. So there is an institutional organ that allows and that needs to be consulted when we speak about the inscriptions. And the same is happening for the Intangible Heritage Convention, which is really interesting because it's the only convention that speaks also about indigenous cultural heritage as important, but only in its preamble, not in the legal text. And why? Well, maybe a good information to share is that this particular convention that deals with cultural practices and traditions was not ratified only by 12 states in the world, including United States, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, Israel, Canada. So, and some other countries that are completely almost, we say, failed states, yes, so for different reasons. But the consideration of the indigenous empowerment that is in this convention was very present, and UK has not ratified this convention to United Kingdom. So these troubles are there, but they are not covered under the carpet. Right now, everyone speaks about them openly. And we have delegates from African states, from Asian states that, go to the stage and they say, well, this is Eurocentric, we hate it, we don't want it anymore. So the atmosphere has changed a lot.
I think the indigenous groups are actually going to break through though and get more recognized in this process.
Yeah, I would say so. Though I was observing the 30 years of struggles to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that happened in 2008 or 7, if I'm not mistaken. But it took 30 years to adopt declaration, so not legally binding instrument, but they did it. So I would say, and the way this indigenous group movements has institutionalized in the recent years, also thanks to technology, thanks to, these online connections, the ability to advocate and support their own rights, this is enormous trend that I see. And actually, this is also the trend that is happening with the omission of the level of states. So right now, indigenous groups are able to transfer themselves directly to international level, sometimes, against their own governments, which is amazing thing happening.
So we've got a list of 6 people now on the list, so let's try to keep both questions and answers short. We only got 20 minutes left, so.
Thank you, Hannah, for your presentation. This is very useful for me too. I think there's many similarities on what you said about kind of the expansion of these spaces, institutionalized space for indigenous people in the UNESCO, but I think across kind of the UN system, as I study like climate change and biodiversity forums. But at the same time, I want to ask you about kind of these attributes of the communities, right? Because although you have the expansion of these institutionalized spaces, still you have a specific group that is the nation states that have a specific right? That's the first right, that is to vote and finally decide what will be passed. So I want to ask you, like, how then you have the nation states, then the NGOs, third sector, and then activist groups, how do these different groups use the list to pass their agendas if they don't have the same right in this level? And another one that really quick, you said like these different levels, right? It's like a circular movement. Have you seen in a way kind of in the ground, in the local level, like how is this discussion then about heritage specifically translated to a local situation that not necessarily, because sometimes these wordings that are in these documents, they're very technical. So how do you translate that back? And then how is this influence back to the global space?
Thank you for perfect questions, transaction and translation to local level. Yeah, I'm just noticing, so I will not miss anything. So first, the attributes of communities and the differences in the ability to influence the final decisions. That exists for sure. UNESCO's the whole UN system is intergovernmental organizations, and these are the delegates of states that has the greatest privilege, yes, to take the final decisions. But they are not allowed now not to take into account what other groups are trying to sell. So for example, for the convention I'm very much following, for the 2003 Intangible Heritage Convention, this happens so that when they prepare the agenda of the meeting, there is a point in the agenda, report of NGO forum, which was not in the agenda 3 years ago, but now it is in the agenda. And in this report, NGO forum is addressing important or difficult issues that it wants delegates to take into account. And this separation in the privileges exists. I will be naive to say that it doesn't. However, we have to take into account the practice. We are sitting, the way we sit here, we are also sitting at this UNESCO meetings. People like me, I was once in the delegation, now I'm working for NGOs, but we are all intermingling, we are discussing, we are talking. People are influenced by different ways, on different levels, and not only through formal procedures, but also informally. So I would say that that's why I'm speaking about international community, not in this old traditional way of thinking about community of, post-Westphalian system of states, but also as embracing many more actors. Of course, states will always protect their right. There are some states who are even, able to say, we don't want to hear those observers, but they are in really a minority. So that will be my answer to your first question. And for the second, how you translate this huge framework, terminology, concepts into the local level. I was observing, and I'm still observing this in my own eyes, because I was writing the first nomination from Poland to the Intangible Cultural Heritage List, and that this is actually a representation of a community that I was working with in Krakow. So they produced this wonderful szopkas, which are Christmas cribs resembling the nativity scene of Jesus Christ, but in the architecture, miniaturized architecture of Krakow, and also with some figurines that are representing topics important for the craftsmen. For example, political topic. We had szopkas with Ukrainian refugees last year, or the world topic, yes? So different types of figures could appear. We had, of course, szopkas with Trump. Now, probably with Biden could also happen. So it's up to the individual person to think about it. And then this is not a level, or this is not a thing that they will consider them, we belong to heritage of humanity before the inscription. But after the inscription, and we got inscribed in 2018, this concept that we are now on the list is permitting the local decision making. So, for example, the city council took a decision allowing those people to rent on a very low rent amount. We call it artistic houses. Yes, Krakow is a very crowded city, and it's extremely expensive to rent a home or to rent an apartment. And you can see only miniature szopkas here, but they can reach up to 5 meters. If you will work on 5-meter szopka and you live with 4 kids, in a small apartment, how do you do it? Yes, so they were given this privilege from the city council after the inscription, taking into account its meaning to humanity. Yes, so we maybe not necessarily see that the community itself speaks UNESCO language. They will not, but the other governance elements, and I would say that in Krakow we have quite a polycentric governance of this tradition, are influenced by UNESCO language. And also what is discussed at the policy or collective choice level what we accept as representing heritage community is coming back. For example, imagine that these szopkas before the war, they were containing figures of Jews who were important part of Polish community. Now the presence of such a figurine is raising different, contexts. And so it is, so I would say that this language or this sensitivity that is built on the policy level is also influencing the operational level.
Gustavo.
Okay, so very interesting topic. So a couple of comments first is like, just to clarify first, what the list doesn't do. So it doesn't give you access to the resource. So consider Statue of Liberty. I am a non-US citizen. I go to a US embassy and say, I want to visit the Statue of Liberty. It's heritage of the humanity. Give me a visa to go visit and then leave the country. I say, no, that Trump national foreign national immigration policies, okay? Good, so it doesn't give you access. Second, imagine that next week the US wants to turn down the Statue of Liberty, and I am not a US national, say, oh, no, the Statue of Liberty represents liberal political values, even for people that are not Americans. I want to block that. I am allowed to, no, essentially, they can do it. So it doesn't give you access to a resource. It doesn't give you the possibility of defining everything about the resource, okay? So essentially what it gives you, no? So essentially it's, so people asking for recognition of their culture, okay? And then that put me in the direction of thinking, maybe we should be careful with having this list, okay? So first of all, we may be picking up a lot of unnecessary cultural battles. And second, what about essentially transmitting this value to everybody in the world? It's like, well, again, you don't need that everybody rubber stamp your culture. So you have your culture there, you have your symbols, okay? People can visit, you can show, but you don't need some kind of international authority to rubber stamp your culture. And the list is essentially pushing exactly in the opposite direction.
Thank you, Gustavo, for this. What list doesn't do? We were discussing, I think it yesterday, even that this whole existence, that we know that Statue of Liberty is there and it represents some values. It's sometimes enough. Yes, we do not have to enjoy it by person, but we can enjoy it intellectually and mentally. And so we are, and this is what we are doing, yes? When we plan, sometimes, I don't know if you do it, I sometimes do some imaginary tours in my mind, and some of them are also around UNESCO heritage sites that I probably will never see. Maybe like this Angkor Wat, but I would love to see, but probably it will not happen. Yes, but its sole existence give me the understanding of how cultural diversity could be cherished. Yes, so I wouldn't say that only by being in a site or taking part in the practice is what list is supposed to do. On the other hand, you are addressing a very political thing, like why shall we even have the list? Lists definitely involves hierarchy. List involves selection. List involves exclusion. And believe me, we had a very strong discussion in 2002 when the convention that was adopted a year later in 2003 on intangible heritage practices was adopted. There was a huge group of experts that wanted not to include the listing mechanism to the convention, saying, we see it on the World Heritage List. This is an instrument that and this, power struggle and this boosting of our prestige, show off, beauty contest that we don't want to have with the identity of people. But there was a very powerful argument used. And that argument sold, and it bought all countries that ratified the convention. that this is, we don't know the better way to make others knowledgeable about what we are proud so of. And the list argument won. Yes, we wanted to have a list because we wanted to have the same success, and this is the most successful international list. If you, and the UNESCO label is considered among Shell, I think Coca-Cola and British Petroleum as one of them, and the Red Cross as one of the top international marks, logos, yes? So this is really a success. Nobody wants to, not to be a part of success, of being, of a sad part, not wishing that we have success. So this is why, and this discussion happened, that's for sure. This is not a naive or neutral mechanism. I wouldn't claim that at any point. But at the same time, you also asked the question how to address problematic issue as a normal citizen. And this is happening. This is amazing because UNESCO is obliged to accept all correspondence coming from all different organizations, individuals, whatever stakeholder is interested, alerting that something wrong is happening in the site or with the practice. How the decision on the delisting of racist element happened. Not because Belgium said, oh, we are sorry, we have a racist element, let's delist it. No, no, no. These were NGOs and groups of activists who were bombarding UNESCO for some time with their reports about what's happening on the ground. They were made available to the public. We all could see what the correspondence looked like, what were the arguments used. We could go to the links with the, videos showing this practice and then take the decision. So I would say that the current technology gives unprecedented possibility for us all to feel that we really have an option to influence a little bit the course of action taken at international level.
We have 7 minutes left. We have 5 people on the list.
Sorry, I will be.
James
So
won't-
maybe we can take all questions and then I will answer.
We can take all questions and then.
What power does that list confer?
Some questions.
This is merely a convenience list. Excuse me? You're on the list, yeah. But next is Jamie.
Hey. And Hanna, I always enjoy your work because I think it's appropriately provocative. There's you say a lot of things that I find interesting and appropriate even to my work, and sometimes I don't agree with it, which is awesome. Yeah, I agree. Something that I think is a challenge of this paper and why you use the phrase wrestling with the IAD framework is because I think there's an ontological difference between commons, like the example that you presented with the Valencia irrigation system that Lynn talks about, and that was then nominated to the list, and then UNESCO itself. So the idea of a commons is a closed society. UNESCO is the idea of an open society where people who don't know each other have this part in determining what goes on the list, right? And so does. I don't really I'm trying to have a question. I see this happening and it's a tension I don't know how to resolve. And I think it's partly because you talk about I'm sorry. You talk about ontological status. And on page 11, you talk about how these lists govern the commons by putting them into new settings by influencing their ontological status. But if their ontological status changes, then doesn't the value of the thing as the commons for which it was nominated to the list change? I mean, is it a commons anymore? And then what does that do? And then does it make it less valuable to the list?
Okay, I'm looking at the list. I'm next. And this is gonna sound tongue in cheek, but in a way it's really serious. This is UNESCO's Heritage of Humanity list is a list of positive heritage. Would it not be equally valuable? Would it not be equally valuable for UNESCO to have a list of deplorable heritage, which would actually reinforce the UN's mission? So racism, war, anti-Semitism, those are all part of the common heritage of humanity also. But they're not on this list. In fact, they're kept off this list intentionally. Right, but the heritage of Jim Crow, you know, all that kind, apartheid. All that kind of stuff is part of the deplorable heritage of mankind. Wouldn't there be a list for that? And there you would have not like, you wouldn't have the United States promoting the legacy of Jim Crow. You would have some other country promoting it, and the US would have to defend. Okay,
I have it on my list.
Subhamal.
Thank you, Dr. Schreiber. Lovely presentation. I'll give a example so that you can touch on all those that you actually spoke about. So the Guruvayur temple in Kerala, southern India, 14th century temple, 2020 it makes the list.
It was there.
Okay. So in 14th century, the temple was premised on 56 elephants. So the animal rights or animal respect was taken care of. But the lower caste people and women were never allowed till 1931, when Mahatma Gandhi led a revolution and lower caste people started getting it. Women were still not allowed till the last 5 years, when the Indian Supreme Court even gave a judgment that women also have equal rights. So some activist women went a couple of years, but after that again that has stopped as a practice. Now in 2020, how would UNESCO factor this in? And let me tell you that this morning, the new Indian Parliament building, the first legislation that was passed was 33% voting rights to women in the lower house early this morning. So the same government, whose priorities are also changing and going back to the ancient times, to a 14th century. So where does this whole cocktail of priorities fit into a UNESCO kind of thing? Thank you.
And final question goes to Jessie Kate.
Okay, and it's a super cool topic, and I think you motivated it really well. I love the philosophy kind of aspect in the beginning that really situates the notion of lists in general. Two questions that I had were on the IAD framework itself. I confess I've read the paper kind of at a first level, but I haven't sort of meditated deeply on it. So apologies if it's addressed in there, but I guess I wasn't clear if you're using the IAD to map the insights you've already had, or you're using the IAD to generate insights. So like methodologically, yeah. And then the second is, you talk a lot about the credibility dilemma, and I'm not sure I'm convinced it's a dilemma. It seems like maybe more of a free rider problem. And obviously those can overlap a bit too, but if I, and you have much more experience here, so, but if I put myself in the mindset of somebody who's trying to get something on the list, then I'm gonna be trying to co-opt the existing credibility of the list for whatever it is I want to put on the list, which to me feels like a free rider problem. I have to run, so I'm sorry to do that. Thank you so much.
Okay, Hanna, can you answer all of those?
Yeah.
I mean, people can stay afterwards for a few minutes if they want to complete this, but maybe just sum up or something, and then we'll get back to these.
Yeah, because Jessie is leaving, so both generate and describe. I think that works for both things because it's a changing and very dynamic process. So I will use AID framework for both things. Yeah, and for the rest, actually the World Heritage List contains Auschwitz, the concentration camp, and it was one of the first inscriptions that happened in 1979. Not as something we want to cherish, not as an architecture of outstanding universal value, but as a symbol of atrocities that we want to remember as a humanity in order to let them not happen ever again. So we definitely have a very strong discussion about negative heritage elements. We have strong discussion about memorizing atrocities. For example, Japan-Korean discussion that is permitting UNESCO about the so-called comfort woman for Japanese soldiers from Korea, and about keep inscribing camps and places where they were kept as a heritage of humanity. So this is there. We are not
So you could.
saying it's a happy to go list.
Plantation system could go on the FAO list as a memorialization of slave labor.
Yeah, and this is happening, and it happened already. I've been to such a place in Mauritius, one of the first, places related to the sugar plantation. So this is happening. This is there. We are not saying that this is only about positive heritage. The negative heritage, great, I would say, a great research area. Very prolific with great names like Lynn Maskell, like Sharon McDonald. Plenty of those.
It should be in your paper a little bit at least.
Yeah, I'll try to embed it too. So Bimal used a very good term, cocktail. Yes, we have a cocktail of all these troubles. We have a cocktails of different cultural sensitivities and of a changing place of women in this discourse too. The issue of gender balance is also new topic for these international organizations. Just to say that we stopped talking about the chairman of the meeting. We now have chairperson. Slight difference, but showing that, but we really want to be more inclusive. I would say this is a topic that also relates to the change in cultural traditions. Yes, how and when we say this is censorship, according to international standards that want to see women in the tradition, which traditionally were excluded. This is a great question, but this is not easy. There's no easy answer. And the same goes for ontological status, I would say. This is a huge thing, and I would not be able, I think, to give you like a super simple answer for that. But I have all these questions on my list, and I'm sure Bartosz has noted all of them too, and we will definitely be happy to take them all into our paper and to make it better. And yes, so please also, if you have some notes on this feedback notes, we would be more than happy to collect them and to reflect more. And we are extremely grateful for all.
Well, thank you, Hanna. Thank you very much. And Bartosz. Yeah, and the cocktail metaphor is perfect because that's like the happiest time at the actual meetings, is cocktails.
That's true. That's true. This is how we influence delegates of states.
I've always referred to the annual meeting of the parties to the climate change conventions as global roving cocktail parties.
We sometimes call UNESCO the fatal agency, because they take us every year to some other place. But this is nice.
In 2018, Stefan was at the UNESCO.
Yeah, I know, in Krakow. Yeah. We were together there, but we didn't know each other at that time. Yeah.
Stefan.
I saw it.
Oh.